Hello and welcome back to another Wainrider Wednesday, the weekly series where we take a look at progress on the upcoming mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, Total War Wainriders, set in the Third Age conflict between the Wainriders and Gondor, and of course involving a lot of other factions around the known parts of Middle-earth. And in today's episode, we're going to look at the Chiefdom of the Angren. This is one of the factions that is not strictly attested in the lore, but we know that the region that they occupy was manned, was garrisoned by people of this sort. We've just sort of split them out as somewhat of a distinct independent political grouping, and this is the episode where we talk about the reasoning behind that. I think one of the things that I can do, again, like we did with the Woodland Realm episode, is read through this little background information, because that, I think, will maybe give you a better sense of what we were thinking behind this faction, and then we'll take a look to see what they can expect on the campaign map. So, the Iron River that the elves and the men of Gondor name Angren flows through many lands to the sea, hills and plains and whispering marshes. But it has its source in the arms of the mountains, near the black spike of Orthanc and the mighty ring that circles the tower. Old is that stonework, and maybe none now live who can craft its like. At the height of Gondor's power, the fortresses at Angrenost and Aglarond guarded the northwestern borders of the kingdom and watched the traffic along the north-south road. But in the Great Plague, the watches on the borders faltered. Many of the soldiers and their families removed eastward across Calenardon, and command of the strong places was left in the hands of hereditary chieftains. Of the defenders of the fortresses, only a few claim descent from people of Gondor. Most are folk whose forebears have dwelt in this land since before the coming of the tall man out of the sea. Some call these latter Gwathwarim, people of the shadows of the hills and mountain vales. Of late, as the power of Gondor seems to wane, more and more of these folk cross the Angren, moving with their herds or seeking secure homes. Many take up arms in service of the chieftain, manning walls and patrolling lands that seem almost forgotten by the king, troubled as he is by the threat of invaders from the east. And west and north, for many long leagues, the lands are unwelcome to strangers. The North Kingdom far away is rumored to be beset by sinister powers. Few riders come from that way. The people of the Enedwaith, the Middle Wilderness, have offered little trouble in the past, but perhaps the time is right for a chieftain of the fortresses to begin to gather such folk under the banner of the Tower, to ensure that some other leader does not raise them in war against the old Númenórean defenses. While once mighty nations groan under pressure from tireless foes, what shall the lesser folk do? To whom does a chieftain's allegiance run? To an absent lord, or to a people without a leader? So we've, in some ways, moved forward the timeline, I guess, in terms of the idea of a quasi-independent Orthanc. You, of course, hear hints of this in the appendices, in Unfinished Tales, and I believe it's maybe a few centuries in the future that you really get a sense of Orthanc being completely overthrown or supplanted, I guess you could say, by these native peoples, these people who are not owing any form of allegiance any longer to Gondor. Now, at the beginning of the mod, we're doing everything that we can to make this Chieftain of the Angren allied with Gondor. At the beginning, of course, they will be in an alliance, but given the way Rome Total War works, it may not be possible for this alliance to last terribly long, so we're sort of leaving it open there. But the idea is very much that we do read about these essentially hereditary chieftains of Gondor who were sent to, Orthanc and Aglarond, I suppose, to man those fortresses, to watch that border, but over time, the focus of Gondor necessarily drew inward to the middle regions around Minas Anor and Osgiliath. Calenardon, we know, was essentially largely depopulated by the time of the mod's start, and so we were in a bit of a bind with Gondor, right? How do you represent them? Because they would own a lot of territory. But we didn't want them to just be the only faction south of the Grey Flood, because that would lead to them taking over a lot of territory very easily, theoretically, and we didn't want that to happen. So some other faction in this area was necessary, and for a while, this Chieftain of the Angren, as we're calling it now, I had conceived of them as essentially just Dunland, right? If you picture where Dunland starts in, like, Fourth Age Total War, just on the western slopes of the southern Misty Mountains, that's where I had placed them, and I had pictured them as a sort of a more Celtic faction, even went so far as to doing some retextures and that sort of thing. That never quite sat right with me, I guess, and so when Webbett and I were sort of developing the factions, we hit on this idea here of having this as a separate faction in allegiance to Gondor, but with the option, of course, of turning against them. And so that's where we've gone with the faction currently. Now, just as a sort of a linguistic note, we're calling them Chiefdom of the Angren. You may wonder why not Eisen. Well, that's because Eisen and Isengard were very studiously avoiding those terms in the mod. Those are words that are from the language of the Rohirrim, right, which is represented in Tolkien's literature as Old English, essentially. So Eisen is essentially Old English for iron, but we're using the Sindarin term Angren, which is what the people of Gondor would have used, so that makes sense. So Angren refers to the river. It also is a call to Angrenost, which is the name of the fortress. So with that all out of the way, let's jump into the campaign map. And here we have the starting position of the Chiefdom of the Angren, just 2 settlements, but what settlements they are. These are very, very strong places. It's a really interesting faction to start with, I'm realizing, of course, because we've got essentially what would later be known as Orthanc, right, Angrenos, and we've got what would much later be known as Helm's Deep, Aglarond. So these 2 very strong settlements to start off. Nothing else, though. They don't have any other starting settlements in the initial part of the campaign. But together with these 2, you've got sort of this very strong choke point, and obviously control what would later be known as the Gap of Rohan, right? The Gap of Calenardon, I guess, in this period, that watches traffic moving into the west. Now, initially, to your west, there will be a whole lot of rebels, not a lot going on. And again, that's I think that's fine. We'll see how this plays out. There is far to the west along the coast the Black Forest tribes. Their power is mostly concentrated a little bit north of the Grey Flood along the coast, but they do have some presence south of it. So they may be expanding east towards you, and you may want to be expanding west up the mountains. There are going to be some advantages, I guess, to heading up towards Tharbad, taking possession of the fortresses that command the north-south road to secure trade, as well as to get the surrounding settlements for resources and trade as well. And to the east, you'll have Gondor. So this is going to be, for me, the most important aspect of this faction. How does their relationship with Gondor work out? There is a rebel settlement. This is what would later be known as Dunharrow. And in this mod, it is actually a settlement, not simply a fort like it appears in 4th Age Total War. Of course, there's no Edoras, right? But we do have this settlement here, kind of up in the mountains, and there are, I think there's another 1 or 2 sort of mountain settlements in the White Mountains that you may want to make yours, or at least I will for roleplay purposes, because I see these guys as really maybe the closest thing we have to a sort of Men of the Mountains faction. Of course, they're not Men of the Mountains, but they are middlemen, as you'll notice by the UI and in terms of culture. And they have some influence from the Gwathwirim, who are folk related to what would later be known as the Dunlendings, and all those people are related to what were the Men of the White Mountains. So when I'm playing the Chiefdom of the Angren, I'm going to try to secure these White Mountain holds and settlements. And that'll, of course, bring me into some conflict with Gondor eventually, but hopefully not too soon. The way I sort of imagine and sort of hope the campaign is going to play out is you've got the Western Horde, the Wainriders over here. They're possibly going to be moving into Calenardon, moving into Gondor's territory, and they'll be fighting each other while you have some time to build up, maybe secure some rebel territory to your east and west before a big conflict comes. Now, that first big conflict may be with the Black Forest tribes, who are going to be pushing east, and it does have to be said that there's not a lot of territory in terms of settlements between the coast and the Misty Mountains. So it's not like it's going to take them years and years to get over here. They may, let's see, 1, 2, something like 2 or 3 territories really just separating you two, although, of course, the physical terrain is much larger. In terms of up towards the north, Tharbad is also initially sort of a rebel area. This is independent. This is not in the possession of Gondor or Arnor. So what you may be able to do is to get up there and really control that north-south trade. That may mean opening yourself up to conflicts, actually, in the northwest in Eriador. So you may find yourself bordering Arnor or Angmar, whichever of those factions is victorious. You may find yourself bordering the High Elves as well, because they've got some territory, of course, in Rivendell, and they may be expanding down towards, Holland and the Swanfleet River. Those, there's definitely a large power vacuum to your west, and I think that makes for a lot of variation, right? There's going to be a lot of question marks in terms of how that power vacuum is going to be filled. Now, although the Chiefdom of the Angren is classed as a middleman faction, they do have some units that call on that sort of Dunedainic style. You may have noticed the unit card at the beginning of the campaign selection screen shows what look to be longbowmen, essentially. And so they do have units like that. Some very tough units mixed in with those lighter, more wild Dunlending style units. So it'll be an interesting mix. And you may well be able to hold your own against Gondor when the time comes, if it comes. I assume it probably will at some point. But let's take a look at these settlements here. Now, again, the map is to some extent a work in progress. We certainly do have a few things to do in terms of moving resources around, but honestly, we'll probably keep the gems somewhere around here, right? It just makes sense to have them in Aglarond. And you can see we've got the structure that would fundamentally later become Helm's Deep or the Hornburg is largely in place. A lot of those walls were there from very ancient times. And inside we've got sort of a middleman style settlement to indicate that those are the people who are living there. Similarly, over in what would later be Orthanc in Angrenost, we've got the Black Tower itself, of course, and we've got the ring wall around it. The position of this settlement, well, actually, this settlement is totally new on our map. It didn't exist as a full-fledged settlement in 4th Age Total War. You had a fort down here, the Fortress of Dol Baran, which functioned as, a static, permanent fort with not a lot of building options. And you had the Treegarth of Orthanc, representing the aftermath of, Treebeards and the Ents' vengeance on Saruman. But this is, of course, well before all those events, and we do have the Black Tower. Of course, that was built by the Númenóreans, apparently, not by Saruman, of course, and the wall around it. But inside, again, you can tell that cluster of settlements doesn't look terribly Dunedainic, and that is to represent, we've got, of course, middlemen moving in and taking over, and perhaps the Gondorian garrison, which has become a hereditary chiefdom at this point, has gone a little native as well. Of course, if things go very bad for Gondor, your ally, you may be in a position of defending the kingdom. You may be in a position to sort of sweep up territory in Kalinardon and claim it for yourself if the Wainriders move into that territory. That, of course, would open up a whole other can of worms. If you own territory over to the Anduin, you will then be sharing a border with the High Elves to your north, and beyond that, the Eotheod, who are eventually, far in the future, going to ride down south as the Rohirrim, or become the Rohirrim under Eorl the Young. And so it would be interesting indeed to see a conflict develop in that way between the chiefdom of the Angren and the Eotheod, several hundred years ahead of schedule, so to speak. Probably endgame for this faction is going to involve taking over enough territory to your west, getting you to the sea or close to it, probably up to the Grey Flood for sure, and then maybe over towards the Anduin. Now, we haven't established victory conditions yet. This is just sort of me talking off the top of my head. But, one of the things you may do, in addition to conquering settlements around the White Mountains, is, finding yourself in conflict with Gondor, and maybe taking western Gondor, maybe even going down and involving yourself around Ithilien. Although it certainly does look like quite a far distance from your capital. But the thing to remember is the roads here are excellent, so it is not as far as it looks. You'll be able to get men down into Anorion towards Manus Anor a lot quicker than you may think, because of these ancient Númenórean-style highways. I hope you enjoyed this look at the chiefdom of the Angren. I said last week that the Woodland Realm was maybe the smallest faction on the map, but I'd forgotten that these guys also only have 2 settlements to start. But very different starts, right? The Woodland Realm, of course, is going to mostly count on its forests and its elven units to protect it, but the chiefdom of the Angren is very, very entrenched. They've got not only these strong fortresses, but they've got the mountain terrain and they've got several choke points with the rivers and streams that are in their territory. Of course, it's not going to be a matter of simply defending these two starting settlements. You will have to expand, and that's when things are going to get really unpredictable really quickly, I imagine. So stay tuned. Next week, we'll be going somewhere else on the map of Middle-earth and taking a closer look at one of the other factions for Total War Wainriders. Stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.